Bumpy Johnson, the payment without witnesses.
The ones who came back. After the death of Dutch Schultz, Harlem did not explode. There were no gunshots in the streets, no gang wars, no bodies lying under streetlights. But that did not mean everything was over. In the underworld, when a boss falls, people do not ask who won. They ask something else. Do the old rules still apply? And to get an answer, someone always has to test them. Some of Schultz's former collectors began to reappear in Harlem. Not in large groups, not carrying visible weapons, not making public threats. They did only one small thing. They visited Numbers game locations. They mentioned familiar names. And they repeated a sentence everyone had heard before. The protection money was still due. It was not an order, it was a test. The message spread quickly, not through phone calls, not through written notes, but through short conversations. And eventually, it reached Bumpy Johnson.
The decision that was never written.
Bumpy Johnson did not make decisions in moments of anger. He understood one thing very clearly. If Harlem had to bleed to prove power, then Harlem had already lost. According to people who worked close to him, Bumpy always asked 3 questions before allowing violence. First, could this be resolved with words? Second, if someone dies, how will the police respond? And third, after everything is done, will Harlem be more stable? In this case, the answer to the first question was no. The answer to the second question was controllable. And the answer to the final question was yes. That was when the decision was made. No paperwork, no signatures, no written orders. Only a line drawn.
The killing with no witnesses.
What happened next was not loud. Not in daylight, not in a crowded place. There were no gunshots echoing through the streets. Schultz's man did not disappear immediately. He was still seen for a short time, but something had changed. No one spoke to him for long, no one stood too close. And then, he stopped appearing. The police arrived later. They always do. They found a death, but not a cause. The report was neutral. No emotion, no rushed conclusions. But in Harlem, no report was needed. People understood exactly what had happened.
Why one death was enough.
What made this moment unusual was not the death itself. It was everything that did not happen afterwards. No revenge cycle, no retaliation, no second test. The Italian Mafia watched closely. They did not interfere. Not because they were afraid, but because they saw the system was working. According to several researchers, this is why Lucky Luciano accepted the arrangement. No direct control, no men placed on the street, no attention drawn. Because Harlem already had someone responsible for order.
The legacy of controlled violence.
Bumpy Johnson did not build power through blind fear. He built it through certainty. People knew if the line was crossed, there would be consequences. But they also knew, too, if the line was respected, there would be peace. That is the difference between chaos and order. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who stood in the light. But he was not the man who destroyed Harlem. And that is why, when he died, there was no succession war, no riots, no blood-soaked streets. Only a silence, the silence of a city that had just lost its gatekeeper.
The police perspective.
When the FBI began they were already late. Bumpy Johnson left no no ledgers, no signatures, no major. According to FBI files, he was one of the, not because he hid, but because he didn't need to appear. Decisions were made through intermediary, and in the underworld, silence cannot be recorded. To Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was not just dangerous. When the FBI began focusing on Harlem, they were already late. Bumpy Johnson left no clear money trail. No ledgers, no signatures, no major assets in his name. According to FBI files, he was one of the hardest figures to track. Not because he hid, but because he didn't need to appear. Decisions were made through intermediaries, through messages, through silence. And in the underworld, silence cannot be recorded. To Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was not just dangerous. He was a boundary. People did not love him, but they did not want him gone. Because while he was there, violence had limits, money had order, and outsiders knew. Not every place could be entered. One Harlem shop owner once said, "We didn't need him to walk past our store every day. We just needed to know he was still alive." Many bosses died for one simple reason. They created too many enemies. Bumpy Johnson was different. He never took more than necessary, never humiliated allies, never shamed enemies. When violence was required, he used it quickly, cleanly, decisively. And then he stopped. In the underworld, knowing when to stop is a rare skill. Bumpy Johnson did not die on the streets. He did not die in a hit or from betrayal. He died in a restaurant. He sat down, ordered food, and never stood up again. There was no war afterward, no violent transition, no Harlem in chaos. Only one question whispered quietly. Could anyone else hold the line the way he did? Final closing. Bumpy Johnson was not a good man, but he understood the consequences of violence better than almost anyone. And in a world where everyone wanted to be king, Bumpy Johnson chose to be the gatekeeper, the man who decided who could enter and who would never come back. After Bumpy Johnson was gone, Harlem did not fall apart. For a while, everything appeared unchanged. The streets followed familiar rhythms. The numbers game continued. Outsiders remained cautious, but something essential was missing. Not a man, a function. The lines still existed, but no one stood beside it. In Harlem, lines do not protect themselves. Rules remained, but interpretation disappeared. Disputes lasted longer, negotiations became uncertain. Messages required repetition, because one question was no longer answered quickly. Who decides? Without Bumpy Johnson, Harlem had structure, but no referee. And in the underworld, a referee matters more than the rules. When limits lose their guardian, they invite testing. Not loudly, not immediately, but patiently. Small challenges appeared. Questions disguised as business. Visits framed as curiosity. No one rushed. Everyone remembered what happened the last time someone rushed. But memory fades. When it is no longer reinforced, new figures emerged. Some were ambitious, some were violent, some were organized. But none carried the same authority. Because authority in the underworld is not assigned, it is accumulated. Bumpy Johnson's authority came from consistency, from decisions that ended disputes, from limits that were never crossed twice. That kind of authority cannot be inherited. Power takes territory. Control keeps it. Many men knew how to take. Very few knew how to hold. Bumpy Johnson understood that difference. He did not expand endlessly. He contained carefully. And containment is harder than conquest. From the outside, Harlem looked the same. Noise, movement, life. But insiders noticed the absence immediately. Not in headlines, not in police reports, but in timing. Decisions took longer, answers were delayed, certainty weakened, and uncertainty creates opportunity. The Italian Mafia did not rush to fill the gap. They had learned. Harlem without Bumpy Johnson was not an invitation. It was a question. And questions are more dangerous than challenges, because questions do not demand answers. They wait. Bumpy Johnson's legacy was not fear. It was predictability. People knew what would happen if a line was crossed, and what would happen if it was respected. That clarity reduced violence more effectively than force. The most effective violence is the violence that never happens. Bumpy Johnson used force to end cycles, not to start them. He understood. Every act creates a precedent, and bad precedents multiply. Bumpy Johnson was never a king. He was the gate, not standing in front of it, but defining where it was. When he was alive, people did not ask how far they could go. They already knew, and when he was gone, Harlem did not lose a ruler. It lost a limit. That is why history remembers him, not for the blood he spilled, but for the blood that never had to be spilled at all. After the line disappeared, people did not forget it immediately. They remembered how it felt when it was still there. Older figures spoke less, younger ones listened more, because memory for a time can replace authority. But memory fades, especially when it is no longer enforced. A new generation grew up. They knew the name, but not the weight behind it. To them, Bumpy Johnson was a story, not a consequence. And stories do not stop people. Limits do. Without a gatekeeper, power became louder, more visible, more performative, because when control disappears, people try to replace it with display. And display always attracts attention. Attention from rivals, attention from police, attention from history. Bumpy Johnson understood something most men learn too late. You cannot intimidate everyone forever. Eventually, fear demands proof, and proof always comes with a cost. That is why he limited violence. Not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Harlem survived. But it changed. Not into chaos, not into peace. Into something less predictable. The absence of a single decision-maker did not create freedom. It created fragmentation. History does not repeat individuals. It repeats conditions. And the conditions that created Bumpy Johnson were temporary. A specific time, a specific pressure, a specific vacuum. Remove any one of them, and the result changes. The underworld learned a quiet lesson, that the strongest figure is not always the loudest one. Sometimes the most powerful presence is restraint, and restraint rarely gets statues. Bumpy Johnson did not leave behind an organization. He left behind a standard, a way of deciding when something must end. When he was alive, people adjusted their behavior. When he was gone, they had to adjust their expectations. And that is why history remembers Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson not as a ruler, but as the man who proved that limits, when enforced correctly, can hold a city together without ever being written down. In the end, Bumpy Johnson did not control Harlem. He prevented it from destroying itself. And sometimes, that is the highest form of power anyone can hold.